Hello, my name is Arturo Hernandez. I'm with a company here in the county of Ventura called Central Coast ADU, and I'm going to be talking today about ADU development in Ventura County specifically. I'm going to touch on a little bit of the basics first. I want to talk a bit about state laws and then a little bit more about local ordinances kind of mixed in there. And then we're going to end with kind of a general overview of the process, like, step by step of what it takes to get an ADU designed and then permitted in the county of Ventura, and then all cities in the county of Ventura, and also just kind of wrap up with some general information about the construction process. And so specifically what we do here at Central Coast ADU is we specialize in the design and the permit management aspect. In other words, everything that's pre-construction, so not counting the actual building of it. Although we do have an in-house construction company as well. And so that's kind of what informs a little bit of what we do. So to get started here. So ADU basics. And as I go along, if you see any of these 3D models, these are models of real ADUs that we've designed here at Central Coast ADU. So to kind of start, like I mentioned, the basics definitions here. What is an ADU? ADU stands for Accessory Dwelling Unit. A lot of people are becoming more familiar with that term now. And this is a residential unit on a permanent foundation that provides additional housing on existing legal lots with a primary dwelling. And those must include a private entrance, a sleeping area, a kitchen, and a bathroom. Now, there is also the junior ADU, also known as a JADU, and these are also a possibility for people that want to build a specific kind of unit. So this is a unit of no more than 500 square feet contained entirely within the main single family residence. And these must include a private entrance, a sleeping area, and a kitchen. They may or may not include a bathroom, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move along here. So why build an ADU? A lot of people that hear about an ADU that are interested already have the reasons, but they all kind of follow under three main reasons. And so a big one is housing for family, and that is frequently for elderly people. We have homeowners that want to move their parents closer to live with them so they can more easily care for them. Also for young adult family members that they need more independent space, and this provides them an opportunity to have a separate dwelling on the same property. So it's nice, it keeps families close, but also in the long run, hopefully when you pencil out your numbers, you'll find that it will be cheaper to build an ADU and have your family live in it versus renting for a while. Definitely cheaper than purchasing another property. And it's also helpful for visiting guests and or caretakers that might live on site. Now, another big reason to build an ADU is for rental income. And that could be for short-term or for long-term rentals, depending on where you're at. A lot of cities in California limit the short-term rentals. Usually it's got to be at least 30 days or longer. So something to keep in mind for people that are thinking, I want to do an Airbnb, you got to check with your city and see what the possibilities are for that. And sometimes there's a long waiting list to get to the point that they will even allow you to do that. So something to keep in mind up front if you're thinking about doing short-term rentals. And then the third reason to build an ADU is it adds value to your property. So I want to go over ADUs specifically first before we talk about junior ADUs. And we're going to talk about first attached, detached, and then different kinds of conversions that can be done. So starting with attached ADUs, this by state definition is an ADU that is attached to the primary structure. The pro of doing an attached ADU specifically is that it maximizes your usable space especially in smaller yards. Uh, and the reason that's a consideration is because, as we'll see when we talk about detached ADUs shortly, if it's detached from the main dwelling, there has to be a certain number, a certain unit of space between the main dwelling and the ADU. And so that can turn out to be quite a big amount of loss in terms of the amount of square footage you can build your ADU, but also for your yard overall. And so some cons for an attached ADU is that you end up with shared walls with the primary dwelling. And of course, it's closer proximity and less privacy since the primary dwelling is attached. Now, for detached ADUs, the state definition is that it's an ADU separated from the primary structure. The big pro is that it's more privacy, and it also has that kind of multifamily lot feel. So it's a little bit more of a desirable rental. But then the con, again, is that you have that separation space that's required between the dwelling and the ADU. And those separation spaces are city or county specific. So it's not just across the board in Ventura County, no matter what city. It varies from city to city. And so that's something that you definitely want to consider when you're kind of scoping out your yard, trying to figure out what kind of ADU you want to build. And of course, like I mentioned before, when you do an attached ADU, because of that spacing, you lose a little bit more yard space than you would with an attached ADU. So for smaller yards, sometimes it is better to do an attached ADU, especially sometimes we see properties that have really narrow backyards, like narrow, long backyards. Now I'm gonna touch on conversions of existing spaces. And this slide is specifically about converting existing non-habitable spaces. So we're talking about things like garages, barns. And so the definition that I kind of uh, doctored a little bit here in the brackets, non-habitable space on the lot of the primary residence that's converted into an independent living unit. So the pro is that it allows you to utilize existing space like a garage or storage space for housing or monetization. And it also minimizes the amount of loss of your open property space. So in other words, your backyard, you wouldn't necessarily have to take over a part of your backyard to build this ADU because it would be within the footprint of, for example, your existing garage. So a con is then, you lose your garage space. So a lot of people these days are using them for storage a lot, but, people still use them for parking. So then you got to figure out what you're going to do about your storage or your parking situation. And another con, which kind of is and kind of isn't a con, is that the cost of retrofitting a non-habitable space is often as expensive as new construction. So what I mean by that is typically garages are built to be non-habitable spaces, which means in order to bring it up to code to be a habitable space, you have to do significant retrofitting most of the time of at least the foundation and typically also the roof. And so a lot of people think I've already got a floor, I've already got walls, I already got a roof, it should be really cheap. And that's not always the case. Sometimes it can still be a relatively pricey option when you're, or at least the same when you're comparing to new construction. And so this slide is about converting existing habitable space. So we're talking more about, some houses have like 2 living rooms and people say, I want to convert one into an ADU, or people will have 2 master suites on their property and say, I'm going to convert one into its own separate unit. So that's what we're talking about. It's already permitted as a space for people to live, but now we're going to separate it off into its own unit. So the state definition, docked again in brackets, illegal habitable space on the lot of the primary residence that is converted into an independent living unit. The pro is that it is the easiest and cheapest way to create an ADU. Again, there's not really going to be a lot of retrofitting happening like you would see with the garage or a barn. It's already an existing place for humans to live. So, it's going to be a little bit cheaper in that respect. You'll be able to maximize utilization of underutilized spaces. And what I mean by that is sometimes when there's a house with two master suites, there's just one that's sitting there for, sometimes guests that come through a couple times a year. And so this allows people to monetize that space that's not really being used. And it also minimizes the loss of open property spaces. Like I mentioned before, you're not building something new in your yard, so you're not losing that yard space. And these spaces are also really ideal for junior ADUs, especially because junior ADUs are required to be built within footprints of existing properties. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk more about junior ADUs. And some cons here, there's loss of square footage of your main dwelling, so you got to consider that when you're thinking about the value of your property. And it's also not necessarily a practical option for people who are living in the property, just because they would be losing that space. So here I want to talk a little bit more in depth about junior ADUs. Junior ADUs are allowed one per residential single-family residence lot, and they are not allowed on multifamily lots. So be sure to take note of that. You got to check out your zoning there. Now, they are a maximum of 500 square feet without exception, and they must be built within the existing footprint of the main dwelling. So that means you can't really build a junior ADU attached to your house as new construction. It has to be you're separating out this existing bedroom in your house to create a unit out of it. Now, there are some kind of ways around that. I'm not going to get into that right now, but cities are realizing that people are building home additions to convert them into junior ADUs, and different cities have different feelings and policies about that. So something to keep in mind. Now, with junior ADUs, there is an owner occupancy requirement. So you got to keep that in mind. You have to either live in the junior ADU or in the main dwelling. And something I mentioned before is that there may or may not be a bathroom in the junior ADU that is allowed to not have a bathroom in there. But if there is no bathroom in the junior ADU, there has to be an access door between the junior ADU and the main dwelling where the inhabitants of the junior ADU have access to a bathroom in the main house. So either way, they got to have bathroom access, whether it's in the junior ADU or in the main house through a door. So going to talk about ADU laws and ordinances. And I put statewide exemption ADUs very large because this is a very important topic. Basically, what a statewide exemption ADU is a state-created baseline minimum ADU model that local municipalities must allow. So the state has these laws that they said to the cities and counties, you have to allow property owners to build at least an ADU within these specifications. In other words, they can't deny you your right to build that. And so I have here, it's the property owner's right to build guarantor. And these are also sometimes referred to as ministerially approved ADUs. So what is a statewide exemption ADU? These are the specifics here. It's a state mandated minimum of an ADU up to 800 square feet, up to at least 16 feet in height, 4-foot rear and side setbacks. So we're talking about from the property lines, how far away you're allowed to build, and no lot coverage, open space, or minimum lot size regulations. So they can't tell you that you have too much building coverage on your property. Sometimes in the past for ADUs or just building in general, that you couldn't have a certain percentage of your property that was buildings versus open space. So when it comes to ADUs, they can't hold you to those regulations. And this year, there were some updates to the statewide exemption ADUs, including for some areas, you can build up to 18 feet in height, and in others, even 25 feet in height. And there are some updates about front setbacks, and that gets kind of into some specifics there I'm not going to go into, but in some situations, you may be able to build within front setbacks. Now, beyond the statewide exemption ADU, the state does have some additional laws that aren't part of that statewide exemption model, but that the state does impose on local municipalities that say you have to allow property owners to do this. So locally, they have to allow a minimum of one ADU and one junior ADU per single family residence property. So you can build an ADU and a junior ADU. And a one bedroom ADU, they have to allow you to go up to at least 150 square feet. And for a two bedroom, up to 1,000 square feet. And they still have to allow you those 4-foot side and rear setbacks. Now, locally, there are some municipalities that allow you to build up to 1,200 square feet, and in some cases even larger for your ADU. And those are the kinds of questions that you got to start asking at a local level. Of course, the state's going to allow you to build up to a certain point, but locally, if you're thinking of building larger than that, you may or may not be allowed to. And again, the cutoff is basically 1,000 square feet, where the state protects you and says you're allowed to build up to that amount. But beyond that, it's going to fall within the local jurisdiction what their ordinances are. So you'll check either if you're in city limits with your city, or if you're outside of city limits, more in unincorporated county area, then they'll have their own ordinances. Now, when it comes to anything outside of statewide exemption ADU protections, a lot of municipalities do not allow much more beyond what the minimum state requirements are. And a lot of times their local ordinances are more restrictive. So once you exit out of those state protections, things can really significantly change. So this is kind of a helpful little card, some square footage numbers to know. 150 square feet is the minimum size limit for an efficiency unit ADU or JADU. So that's basically the smallest that you can go. It's pretty tiny. 500 square feet is the maximum size junior ADU, as I discussed. This is also the size at which school districts are allowed to charge impact fees for ADUs and junior ADUs. So impact fees are fees that can be imposed by local agencies, and it's usually by square foot that they charge. So if you go over a certain amount of square footage, which is outside of state protections, then they can start charging you per square foot of the size of your proposed ADU. And those will be additional permit fees that have to be paid either to school districts. And again, that's at 500 for the school districts. The next note you'll see there is 750 square feet. And once you get to 750 square feet, you have to pay impact fees to your local municipality. And so those can kind of add up to the tune of a couple extra $1,000 on top of the base permit fees that you're already going to have to pay before the impact fees. So a lot of homeowners, property owners are cutting themselves off at 749 square feet. They're saying, I want to keep my permit fees to the minimum and I don't want to have to pay impact fees. So we'll just cut it off right there. Now, 800 square feet is the maximum size statewide exemption ADU. Again, the state says cities, you have to allow the property owners to build at least up to 800 square feet, no matter what. 850 square feet is a state mandated minimum allowable size for a one-bedroom ADU, and 1,000 square feet is the minimum allowable size for a two-bedroom ADU. 1,200 square feet is the maximum ADU size for local municipalities without ADU ordinances. So like I mentioned, some counties or cities have ordinances specifying the max size. They may go beyond 1,200 square feet, but 1,200 is a good marker there. And the last thing here, this gets a little complicated, and it's typically for larger main dwellings. But 50% of the existing main dwelling is the cutoff size for certain ADUs that are above a certain square footage, as you can read there. So that doesn't apply to too many cases. Like I mentioned, it's mostly for pretty large properties, dwellings, I should say. So I'm going to go over broadly what the ADU development process is. So we have a bit of a timeline here. I'll just read through it quickly here. So it goes from starting at feasibility to plan design, on to engineering, then permitting and construction. Now, when it comes to feasibility, this is the part where we're doing research and professional consultation at the very beginning stages of the project. From there, plan design is the development of the architectural plans. Engineering will be the step where the architectural plans are structurally engineered, and also when Title 24 plans are developed. And I'll touch on Title 24 and structural engineering more in just a minute. Permitting phase is where you're submitting applications, submitting the plans for review. Typically, there are corrections that the city wants clarification on certain aspects, and then eventual approval with the Building and Safety Department. And the final stage is construction, selecting your contractor and building the actual unit. So the feasibility aspect, this is a pretty important aspect, and it's going to start with the property owner or the architect/designer doing some research on your local ordinances to determine the feasibility of your proposed ADU. So you may or may not know exactly what kind of ADU you want to do or how big of an ADU you want to build, but you can do this kind of feasibility research with the city planning department or even online at the planning website to see what they're going to allow generally. And that's always a good starting point, because sometimes right up front, you're going to run into barriers that say it's going to be difficult for you to build an ADU here, or just flat out, you can't build this kind of ADU. So I've got a list of resources there to utilize. There is the state's ADU handbook, which is available online to download. Your local planning desk, planning website, and planning guides. The county assessors and surveyors records to see kind of where your property lines are, and property title reports. You'll have some helpful information in there too. Now, this is, if you take anything away from today, I'd say that this may be one of the most important slides. Having a professional consultant come out to your house to assess your ADU feasibility. So I'm going to kind of go through this real quick, but I want to preface by saying that there are a lot of designers out there who, for better or for worse, maybe kind of new, maybe not be super familiar with ADUs. And this can kind of trip up projects and cause some frustration, and even get to the point where the designer can't get the project through a specific city that they're trying to work in because they can't figure it out for one reason or another. It does happen. And we know personally here at Central Coast ADU because we've had to take over projects from other designers in the past. So these are some kind of key things to look for when you have a consultant come out onto your property to give an assessment. So they should be giving a rough measurement of your existing spaces to determine approximately what your maximum build size is for your ADU and what your setbacks are. They should also identify and discuss with you any necessary retrofitting of an existing structure. Most popularly garage conversions. It's good to know up front what may need to be done so you have an expectation without any surprises later on that you need to, tear out your entire foundation and pour a new one in your garage that you want to turn into an ADU, which can be a pretty big and expensive surprise way that you'll get way later during the permitting process. So you also want to have a consultant that identifies any easements, tree, septic, or geographical issues. And I'll kind of touch on a little bit of those later on. But on a lot of properties, there are existing utility easements that you can't build over. There's certain kinds of trees that are protected that you can't remove, or sometimes you can remove them, but you need an arborist to come and give a report. So that can get pretty complicated with trees alone. There are some city, but mostly county properties that are on septic. There are considerations for that that can get pretty pricey. So good to know those up front. And other kinds of geographical issues, fire hazard areas, hillsides, things to consider that an experienced professional will know when they go on site to look for. They should also be locating your utility meters and discussing with you what your ideas are for whether you want to share meters or have separate meters for your proposed ADU and how those things can impact the design. They should discuss with you what the permit process is if you're not familiar, including the design process too, and what some approximate timelines are for getting those completed within their company and what they're working with. They should discuss with you what the budgetary expectations are for pre-construction and construction phases. Again, if you don't know those things up front, you don't want to get any surprises down the line. You don't want to start something, invest a lot of money into it, only to find out that this thing comes from, out of left field that is going to cost you $20,000, and all of a sudden you can't afford to do your project. So the more you know up front, the better. And then they, of course, should address any of your questions or concerns. And they should hopefully follow up with a formal bid or a proposal. You definitely want to have a signed agreement. Anybody that's working outside of those, you're putting yourself at risk. But they should, at the very least, detail what the scope of work is going to be that they plan to complete for you, what the price is going to be, and what the payment schedule is going to be. I highly recommend probably not working with somebody that requires 100% upfront, because that's pretty risky. But if they have a payment schedule you're comfortable working with, then definitely look for that. What the exclusions are for the scope of work, because sometimes designers don't do everything in-house. For example, a lot of designers are doing structural engineering, not in-house. That's usually another professional that needs to come on, but it all has to be coordinated and done within the same process to get it permitted. And if it's an architect, sometimes the architect does their own engineering. So you want to check with them for those licensed architects, and get an idea what the timeline for the major milestones are, and if there are any special terms, for either the proposal or if there is anything that they're doing for you outside of just the ADU. If you're doing an addition, also make sure if it's all part of the same job that it's all on there. So let's see, plan design. We talk about hiring a licensed architect or designer or drafter. So there's a distinction to be made there. A licensed architect, is licensed by the state to design pretty much, a lot of things, definitely ADUs. If this is a residential, somebody that specializes in residential architecture. And contrast that with a designer or a drafter that is not licensed, but still may be an experienced professional. For example, Central Coast ADU. We are not licensed architects, but we've designed a lot of ADUs in Ventura County, other things too, like additions. And so there are a lot of professionals working that are not necessarily licensed architects, but very experienced designers or drafters. So a typical scope of work would be the architectural plan design, the engineering coordination to make sure that the structural engineer gets what they need to complete that scope of work, and also the permit management. Usually that's what the scope of work looks like for a project like an ADU. I've got a list of questions to ask here when you're thinking of hiring a design professional. So I don't want to go through those in detail there, but I would say that an important one that we are finding in working with clients, especially projects we've had to take over, is can they do basic mechanical plans, especially gas and water pipe sizing. We see a lot of projects that get held up at the city because the designer doesn't know how to do those things. And some cities require those things. It's very detailed work. So this is the plan design process. This is something I'm just going to kind of gloss over quickly here. Once you hire a professional, they'll come out and measure your property, write down in some cases every single little closet. Usually they'll take photographs and videos to help in the drafting process. That's where drafting is where everything kind of gets drawn within the technical software. And eventually that is what's used to create the architectural plans, which is with all the notes and property information. Now, eventually, that those architectural plan sets go to a structural engineer, and the structural engineer typically focuses on some framing details, but mostly it's going to be your foundation details and your roof details. And the Title 24 report is a report that must be completed to demonstrate an ADU's compliance with state energy efficiency standards. So once all of that is together, your architectural sheets, your structural engineering sheets, your Title 24 sheets, and a couple of booklets for your structural engineering and Title 24 report, you've got your whole architectural plan set, or your whole just general plan set, including the architectural. And that's what's going to be needed to submit to the city or to the county to eventually get your permits. So since Central Coast ADU specifically doesn't do construction, we are not contractors. Just kind of want to touch on a couple of things here. The cost and start date and timeline are things you want to consider when you hire your contractor. And you can also consider being an owner builder. So that's something that you want to discuss with your design professional. And I do have some additional information here, but I'm just about out of time. So hopefully we can share this presentation with people that attend this segment. Skipping through a lot of slides there to get to the end, but we are Central Coast ADU, and we specialize again in design and project management and permit management. And we are located in the city of Ventura, serving Ventura County now, specializing in ADUs specifically for the last 2 years. And we grew out of a construction company called Central Coast ADU, also here in Ventura, all family-owned companies. And we are happy to help and answer questions and free consultations if you are thinking about doing an ADU. So thank you all so much for your time, and look forward to hopefully hearing from some of you.